In May of 2005, Don Carson says, homosexuality will be to the 21st century as indulgences were to the 16th century. They will not be the issue that divides the church, but the presenting issue that divides the church. We're talking top theological stories the last 25 years. Every major mainline denomination split over this.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gospelbound. I am not Collin Hansen, but I am here with him and with our friend and colleague Mike Graham, who is the program director at TGC's Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. My name is Sarah Zylstra, and I'm a journalist at the Gospel Coalition, and I am here today to ask the questions. Mike and Collin, it is great to see you again.
Let's keep doing this, Sarah. We're on a roll.
We're on a roll.
Let's keep going.
As our listeners of last episode know, we are halfway through a fascinating list, and this is the top 10 theological stories of the 2020s. I was about to say 2020s. That would be a lot of theological stories. Yeah. Of the 2000s, life has changed dramatically for all of us in a lot of ways over the last 25 years. Think smartphones and social media, changing views on sexuality, and painful political polarization. And we hear about all those things in the mainstream media or on our social media feeds, but what we hear about less, and what I'd argue is even more consequential, is these storylines of how our country's relationship with God has changed and shifted since the 1990s. That has been significant, and I think it affects all of these other stories. So here's a quick recap from what we did last time. Number 10 on our list of top 10 theological stories was the global church leadership moves south, and by that we mean Africa south. Number 9 was denominations decline as non-denominational churches rise, and maybe some of that is just denominational churches taking the denominational name off of their sign. Number 8 is China cracks down, following the fast growth of the church there. And we could also say that about other areas of the world, but China is the one that has been in the news the most. 7 is the great dechurching, which is forcing or maybe opening up opportunities to different apologetic strategies for the church. And number 6 was the great awakening, which runs from Ferguson to Floyd, and which changed a lot of ways that people think about things. Today, we're going to finish up our list, and we're going to work our way from number 5 to number 1. You guys ready for this?
That's what I'll ever be.
All right.
It's my idea, and it's my list, and I'm still daunted by it.
All right, let's just take one bite at a time.
What could go wrong?
Yep. Collin, what's number 5? Tell us what number 5 is.
It's a little worrisome when your number 5 is COVID-19 shutting the world down. If that's not number 1, you got to wonder what the other 4 are going to be in here. I need to go back and give some context here. It's fascinating what from history we choose to remember, what we choose to forget. This is, I think I remember first seeing this from Andy Crouch, which shout out to Andy as having the best early insight to COVID-19 that helped me and countless others during those days in 2020. But this was the biggest disruption in physical church meetings across the world since the Black Death of the 14th century. I mean, we've had wars, we've had other diseases, we've had flus, we've had all sorts of different stuff, but we've never had a disruption like this to churches physically meeting together. One thing I often will tell people, it's one of those things, not just looking for what happened, but what did not happen. It is the first major national tragedy in American history with no call for religious unity or meaning, where, especially in those early days with President Trump and those press conferences, the high priests of our cultural interpretation and intercession were the scientists. That was originally everybody looked at, but you just saw no, part of it's because of the inability to gather, but there was no major push for coming together, there was some of it, which was undone by especially the response, the death of George Floyd and the response to it. So that goes back to our earlier conversation, because these two are very linked. That's why they're together, this top 10 list. They're distinct, but they're but they're linked. But there was no major push toward kind of a turn toward God or a turn toward intercession from religious leaders or let alone Christian leaders there. But then, as we've seen already with so many of these other stories, there was a major backlash. So scientists are held up as the great high priests to intercede on our behalf. And yet then, as more information comes out and the lying, the admitted, confessed, since then lying, from those same scientific leaders, things about masks, things about 6 feet apart, things that they just spoke confidently about that they did not understand. I did a podcast earlier for Gospelbound on 5 years since COVID-19 shut the world down. I talked more about that there. But this has been a major catalyst for widespread institutional mistrust, and that affects church leaders. That affects our work at the Gospel Coalition. That affects everybody. That affects theologians. That affects how people learn. And also, I think something that had been, I think it was Ross Douthat who said that COVID-19, I can't remember what he said, was it like 5 years happened in 1 year? Things that might have taken 10? Was it 10?
10.
Yeah, so a decade. A decade happened.
Douthat said we had a decade's worth of conversations in 1 year.
Yeah, so I suppose that probably includes Floyd then as well. But like 10 years of shifting toward online being prime, of just everybody being forced to learn how to do Zoom at the same time. I mean, just look at all the podcasts. My podcast this podcast started right before COVID-19. But look at that huge growth afterward as well. So just the sense that the real action is happening online. Now that might even be unwound. I don't know how AI is going to affect that, but that might even unwind in the days ahead. But that was a huge implication. And then just the last implication to think about has had huge theological effects in so many different ways, but it connects back to one of the earlier topics. This is something that really can continue to divide the West from the East. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the way the disease came out of China, and then efforts to be able to cover for how that disease originated, which still is not commonly determined as far as I know. Plenty of people have strong theses and some stronger than others, but I don't think that's been officially acknowledged as far as I know. But just a lot of that mistrust across the East and the West. And I alluded to this earlier with the broader dynamics with China, but significant response then, and I'm not necessarily saying that these are linked, but part of the broader separation between East and West would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the significant persecution by Russians toward evangelical Baptist leaders across Ukraine. There was just a sense that the world was descending into a chaos that we had not seen in literally more than we're talking closer to 70 years at that point. So you see the largest land war in Europe since 1945. You then saw the largest murder of Jews since the Holocaust in 2023 on October 7th. So COVID-19 was not directly responsible, but was the most significant catalyst in a broader sense of destabilization, especially in the last 5 years of this 25-year period. So I when I'm talking to audiences about this, I just tell them, you can think about it in the aggregate, but also just think about it in your personal life. I bet that COVID-19, as much as anything else on this list, changed something in a very concrete way in your life. Could be a good way, could be a negative way, but there's no doubt that was not something that left any of us untouched.
Mike, do you have numbers for what it did to the church, like church attendance?
There was definitely a spike in de-churching that was around that time. The attendance numbers that different denominations publish all show a precipitous drop in that time frame. Most have kind of done what they call regression to the mean. So whatever the denomination was doing, after about 3-4 years, it was roughly kind of on that same path. So it does seem like most of the things that happened during that time weren't necessarily permanent. And I think a lot of the churches that, tried to, pivot online, I think 90% of churches had some kind of online manifestation. I think most have not, kind of stuck with at least the same modalities and those kinds of things. So it feels like more of a temporary disruption than a permanent one.
Yeah. Although, Collin, as you're saying, there's probably something in your life that's different. I bet there's also something about your church, right? Or like maybe you do more Zoom meetings, or you probably, my church is still live streaming. I think one person watches, right? But you kind of got in the habit of like, well, I guess we live stream. It's easy. You just push this button and yeah.
We do continuing education cohorts through the Gospel Coalition because everybody knows how to use Zoom now. So what we found is that Zoom is no replacement whatsoever for regular ongoing education, especially for children. But it can be a really excellent supplement in a way that could put you directly in touch with the best teachers in an interactive format around the world. So it doesn't replace anything. There's no widespread movement to say what we really need is to move elementary education online. There's no movement to say we should be moving college education online. In some way, that 10-year experiment, Mike, might have killed the possibility of more shifting. 10 years in 1 year killed the possibility of a lot more shifting toward basic education online. It's clearly not something that's very good, but it's good as a supplement. I just think back to the book that I did during that period called Rediscover Church with Jonathan Leeman. And when we were writing that book, right as all of this was happening, because it was motivated by this trend, we thought, we don't know if people are going to come back. Now, people don't even think anymore about how Mark Zuckerberg was going to lead us all into the metaverse. We were all going to have these online avatars. We were all going to go to church. There were church plants in the metaverse, and everybody saw that they kind of looked like those old Playmobil like stick figure characters.
They look like the Wii characters from the old Nintendo Wii, like the bowling game.
Right. Speaking of the last 25 years, I have the music in my head now, like just kind of bouncing around.
Like Zuckerberg spent like tens of billions of dollars of Meta's good cash.
They changed their name to Meta.
And they blew it on that foolish metaverse.
So,
and you remember all those Fortune 500 companies, they all said, oh, we're going 100% work from home. And it's like, how long did that last? It didn't last very long. Everybody's like, get back to work, get back into the office or you're fired.
Everybody can go, started with Elon Musk. Everybody can go listen to the episode I did on Gospelbound with David Bahnsen where we talk about this, where he's anticipated this. So Bahnsen's view on this when it came to work, that this idea that we'd be able to just all work from home was not going to happen. The productivity levels significantly declined. But in the same way, those prophets saying, hey, it's going to be great, all church is going to be moving online, thankfully turned out to be wrong, because it's, if anything, it's reinforced the physicality, the embodied nature of the Christian life. And that is an irreducibly theological reality. And COVID-19 helped remind us, for better or worse, i.e. the spread of this disease, the weakness of our bodies to be able to fight it off, but also the strength and also the significance, I guess, of what we lose when we don't see other people physically, and especially when we don't gather together in worship. So no doubt, massive story, COVID-19.
Yeah, not a lesson that anybody who lived through that is going to probably ever forget of the...
Or want to relive.
Yeah, or ever want to relive.
Once is enough.
So bookending COVID were Trump's presidencies. Sometimes it feels like he has been president forever, but really not. The one that ran from 2016 to 2020, and then this one that we're in currently, which will run from 2024 to 28. So why did you put Trump at number 4?
Well, again, I mean, look at these stories just keep getting, they're going to continue to get bigger and bigger. And so, if we're at 30,000 feet, you're going to continue to kind of elevate to see the significance, because how many different issues, theologically and otherwise, can you fold under, I guess, like you said, Sarah, some of it's just the Trump President Trump's direct influence. Some of it's things that have happened around him. Some of it's just the fact that not only because he's been president for so long, but in the public eye for so long, this is no doubt going to be considered the Trump era by historians. I don't think that's any dispute at all, but also just with the way he dominates media, the way he dominates thoughts, the way he dominates action. And that's not just the United States, that's around the world. The way everybody needs to react to him and the initiatives or things or tweets or whatever. So that's part of why it feels like it's been forever. And for people who are, younger than us, this is the only president that they've known or remembered, or certainly the only president they voted for. There aren't that many in history that have been in 3 different elections voted for in there. But let's just name a few of the things that have flowed out of this. I think the most significant are related to the Supreme Court. And not every president gets to appoint a lot of Supreme Court justices, but you can go back to those really contentious Kavanaugh hearings. Those were uniquely shaped by President Trump, his resolve to not give in to removing him, to the critics, and those were alleging different misdeeds against him. That was replacing Anthony Kennedy. Anybody who's been listening to my teaching for any period of time knows the significance of Kennedy as sort of America's pop philosopher. His descriptions of the sweet mystery of life and things like that. So in theological and philosophical terms, that was a massive replacement. And of course, Amy Coney Barrett in 2020, right toward the end, very significant with long-standing Supreme Court justice. Of course, many cases long outlive the president who appointed them or the Senate who confirmed them. So those have huge implications. And I don't think this is not specific to Trump, but it's continued. I just need to point this out. Sometimes I feel as though my job is just to be a witness to history and just as a reminder of what happened. I met in January 2017 with a number of Christian college leaders at their invitation. I'm in Atlanta. And they, of course, like many of us, had expected Trump to lose to Hillary Clinton. The plan there, and Sarah, you've done the best reporting on this. I want to know what you remember from this time, but basically the idea was Christian colleges are going to get shut down. I think you're the one, Sarah, who reported not just the removal of funding, but the literal, basically like illegality of what was perceived to be discrimination. What do you remember from that period, Sarah?
Yeah, what I remember is calling up, I think Hillsdale and Grove City are the colleges that don't take funding, and basically like, let's write a how-to of what do you do when the government comes after you and you don't get any funding at all, Pell Grants or any type of funding, and you're just going to need to like privately fund your own education.
If the government allows you to continue to exist,
if the government allows,
when you're functioning against how the law could be interpreted as being discriminatory.
Yeah, and beyond accreditation, will they take your teachers, right? Gordon and their teachers were unable to serve as student teachers in the public schools around there. Yeah, all kinds of stuff.
So one of the biggest stories by far has been the much stronger and strengthened religious liberty protections enacted primarily by the Supreme Court or decided by the Supreme Court in this last decade. That's a huge legacy in the last 25 years and a very positive development, and one that has been assisted quite a bit by President Trump because of the Supreme Court appointees. Again, things were trending somewhat in that way without him, but definitely that's been confirmed with him. Of course, anytime you're going to talk about Supreme Court, you're going to look at one of the major stories embedded in here, and that, of course, is the Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade being overturned in 2022. But as a theme that we keep coming back to, you have both the exuberance of Roe being overturned, something that a lot of us never thought could even be possible, but then also the shift in 2024 of President Trump and with much of the Republican Party in his wake toward a pro-choice position. And then as we've been reporting, as Sarah, you've been reporting lately, I can safely say that there has never been less interest in the pro-life cause in the evangelical church in the 25 years that I've been doing this. We are at a low ebb, and as Sarah, you just reported recently for the first time in how long? I mean, when was the last time abortions were going up
Yeah. I mean, they dropped, I think they hit the lowest point in 2017 and they started to creep up since then, but that's happening globally.
Globally. So yeah, it's not just a Trump story, not just the United States story, but that's been a significant development in here as well. Of course, the centering of immigration as the number one topic for Republican voters, and when you're talking about Republican voters, the majority of those are evangelicals. So immigration becoming probably, I would argue, the most contentious social, cultural, theological issue that's alive today inside the evangelical church, and perhaps even in our broader culture. That's very much the case of how President Trump has shifted the Republican Party platform and policies there, not to mention all sorts of questions about enforcement and whatnot, but that's been a huge shift in there. We've just been able to see, when it comes to theological discourse, church unity, trust in institutions and things like that, you've seen with President Trump a significant rise of populism that's pushed out many urban and highly educated evangelicals, not only from church leadership or but also just within the Republican Party in general. And so what you've seen, though, at the same time is more unity across the races. And some of this has really been changed by the recent developments on immigration, but more unity across the races among evangelicals when it comes to politics, especially on the lower end of the education and economic spectrum. And that's certainly a major change from the earlier Bush administrations, change from Romney, from McCain's coalitions and things like that. So that's been a big development in different ways inside the church. But I just mention two meta trends that are definitely not resolved here before we move on and get to our top three. What we see in general continue under President Trump is a shift away from a view of liberty as something that frees us to do good, but a view of liberty that frees us to do whatever we want. I'm not saying that's unique to President Trump. I'm not saying that's unique to the Republican Party. That's just kind of the American ethos. But I think that has continued to consolidate as the dominant view of what of freedom, of liberty, and of what we're striving toward as a society, is the freedom to be able to tell everybody else, don't tell me what to do. And you can see how this overlaps with COVID, right? So significant development there as well. And then the last thing here, and I don't know, Mike, if you want to add anything here, because we debate this among those at the Keller Center, but with the rise of the much more assertive executive branch, and I don't want to pretend as though that only happened under President Trump, that we've been moving that way. I did a review for Books and Culture years ago about the entire 20th century was moving toward a stronger executive, and President Obama did that, no doubt, very much strongly did that, and then President Bush did earlier as well when it relates to things like national security and surveillance and war powers and whatnot. But it seems as though this more assertive executive branch has bolstered some arguments about post-liberalism, including, and this is another major theological story that very much is a subset of the Trump era, the rise of Christian nationalism and the pursuit of a so-called Christian prince, or the effort to impose doctrinal decrees from the top down. In a way, across people, or in even Old Testament law, across whether or not you subscribe to those views and outside of the church. And so even right now in the PCA, there's a major theological debate about the relationship between the church and the state. So huge theological implications. My goodness, we could do whole episodes just about this part. But Mike, anything to clean up that I missed on that topic?
No, I don't think I have anything to add here. I think that was pretty well comprehensive.
You're doing great, Collin. Yep.
I just need to gather my breath.
Yeah, that's good. Speaking of top down, let's talk about number 3, Obergefell.
Oh, man. I mean, let me just pause here, Sarah, and ask, help take us back to the mindset of how would we describe, this is the largest, Mike, you mentioned the Great Dechurching as the largest and most dramatic change in the church, in church attendance and affiliation in American history. But the largest and fastest moral transformation in American history is the shift of acceptance of homosexuality and of gay marriage in particular. We're old enough, Sarah, to remember how this has changed. Help set the stage for what that feels like, that change.
Yeah, what's interesting about it is that you just don't know what's the decision that's going to change everything. And it's so far-reaching. I'm even thinking in terms of the skyrocketing number of fatherless children, right? So like not only taking apart marriage of a man and a woman so that you could marry someone of your same sex, but so that you didn't have to marry anybody, right? There's just like a lessening of any kind of social pressure around anything to do with sexuality and by extension the family, right? Like raise your kids however you want, with whoever you want, or don't, or, like there's just anything that touches sexuality, from abortion to then, like, I can remember whenever there was people who'd say, what about transgenderism? And everyone else laughed and like, what are you talking about? Clearly that's crazy. And then 2 years later, it was like totally plausible. And so how quickly that shifted and how everything in that orbit just felt like it fell off a cliff.
Can it be a coincidence that ever since gay marriage was not just legalized, but then mandated across the country, 2015, a decision written again by the aforementioned Anthony Kennedy, is there any coincidence that we've been spending the entire time since then talking about the decline of marriage, the decline of interest in marriage, a decline of interest in raising children? This was not a decision that strengthened the institution of marriage. It is a decision that not only redefined it, but then also relativized it as not important. That's been the implication of it.
100%.
Not a rush toward an excitement, exuberance about the openness of it, but a recognition that there's nothing special here to be pursuing, and also a decentering of it as an organizing social just stage of life that is expected for the vast majority. Now it's sort of an option if you feel like it for some.
Yes. And I think we can also trace along that same time period the decline of the ability to tell stories in Hollywood, because without that organizing principle, which had been underneath so many stories for so long, the storytelling got lost.
Rom-coms have almost disappeared. Mm-hmm. That's a major change that you would see if you dropped from the 1990s, an era of really significant rom-coms, into the 21st century. Almost disappeared. It's just not, it would not have the same resonance. Though I do have to make an exception there for basically every Hallmark movie. That's an actual, that's 25 years.
Or even Die Hard. Like it's an action movie, but the whole thing is organized around a relationship with his wife, right? So, mean, there's a lot of action movies that have some sort of male-female relationship underneath it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't go away entirely, but they do become decentered as a kind of norm. But I just want to point this out. This is a significant dimension of the Gospel Coalition's history. And the first meeting of the Gospel Coalition in 2005, Don Carson, Tim Keller convene these church leaders from around North America. They send out these dozens of invitations. Everybody says yes. They show up. And in 2005, May 2005, this is right after President Bush has been reelected. He's heading into his second year. The values voters, so-called values voters, have created a permanent Republican coalition of suburban and ex-suburbanites, according to Karl Rove. Anytime a political strategist says this, you just know he or she is wrong. If you don't like the politics, just wait a while, because let's look in the last 25 years how many things have changed. But so this is the values voters election. Evangelicals are ascendant, and in May of 2005, Don Carson says homosexuality will be to the 21st century as indulgences were to the 16th century. They will not be the issue that divides the church, but the presenting issue that divides the church. We're talking top theological stories the last 25 years. Every major mainline denomination split over this. They all split. They all declined. They all split. The last holdout, the Methodist Church, in terms of the largest denominations, that was because going back to number 10, that's because the way the Methodist Church votes is a global vote. So global South, Asians, but especially Africans, kept the United States conservative on its historic beliefs on sexuality, but at the same time, there was no possibility of Americans being able to wrest control of the declining, to go back to the great dechurching story, of institutions in the Methodist Church, the seminaries and denominational agencies and things like that. So they were stuck in this stalemate, and they finally reached a settlement that produced the global Methodist Church, which in and of itself is a significant development in these last 25 years. But Carson could see that at a time when, and just keep this in mind, I ask my students this all the time and they don't have a clue, gay marriage would be banned in California in 2008. 3 years later, banned in California. The votes were, there was a sense, this is what shifted. There was a sense at the start of this 25-year period that we evangelicals represented a silent majority who were conservative in their values, especially on things like homosexuality. That is not remotely the case. 25 years later, that's even a delusion that seems like it's practically from black and white eras. That's how dramatic this transformation was. And almost all of it happened, not just gradually over time, but basically in a period between 2008 and 2013, leading up then to the 2015 decision. That is also very much the effect of the Obama administration specifically, and Obama pushing that in his second term. I also have to point out to people that the first incoming president who was very proudly pro-gay was Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, both in 2008, were against gay marriage. I mean, we all kind of knew that they weren't really, but that was their official position because they knew that's what the voters would demand. That is how much things have changed, with just huge implications that are easy for us to be able to take for granted. So now I do think about the positive though here, and this makes me reflect. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this, but I think about the ministry that we do with the Gospel Coalition, and at one point it felt like every day there was some other Christian leader who was leaving, like abandoning biblical orthodoxy on sexuality or leaving the church or something like that. And every time they would, there'd just be this major news story and it would feel very despairing. And boy, that hardly ever happens anymore. I mean, that doesn't seem to happen very often. Now, it could be a result of, if you had that view, you're already out of the church or something like that. It could be part of the broader great dechurching dynamic in there, but that just isn't. So I don't know, Sarah, you're always looking for the positive side of things. And I would say the fact that there has been no widespread evangelical abandonment of institutional views on sexuality, that is not something we should take for granted. It didn't necessarily look that way.
And I don't even having a presenting issue like homosexuality or indulgences isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? To judge or to, be able to tell the fruit from something.
To expose the underlying issues, to bring the problems to a head.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
To bring two of our top 10 stories together, and not to just, end this particular one on a sad note, but it is a sad note for me. And it's the way that the racial conversation in America and the sexual conversation in America, I think, got unhelpfully bundled. And the bundling of those two conversations, I think in many ways, it really hurt the ability for evangelicals to process both situations from a helpful standpoint, and left people, I think, in a way where a conversation that was probably, I think there were conversations that were going in a helpful direction, but I think the conversation got cut short and it got truncated. And I think a lot of that was because, I think people in the, broader progressive society wanted to bundle those two things because, one of the fastest ways to win over the country is to basically say, well, if you don't sign on with this, this, and this, then you're racist. And these are one and the same issue. And I don't see them as being one and the same issue. They're not. But I think the bundling of those two issues really created a lot of complexity for evangelical leaders. And I think it cut a conversation that had some productivity there to it, but it definitely cut it short. And that conversation just crash landed. And I don't really know if we've recovered from that. I'm grateful that evangelicals have held the line on traditional sexual ethics, but I think one of the things that's been a casualty of that has been that broader conversation about race.
Boy, Mike, that's a really astute point, and that allows us to then go back to what we talked about in the previous episode, the Great Awakening, because that originally is a racial category, correct? I mean, that originates out of African American culture about being awoken to the dynamics of racial injustice. And sometimes has the implications that you mentioned, go further down into critical race theory and whatnot. That's the basic idea. But now when you talk about being woke, it could apply to a million different things, but specifically, it often has a corollary to sexuality, and especially things like LGBTQ. So that's exactly, it becomes a label on that crosses that spectrum and makes conversations really confusing. It makes it difficult for you to obey, I think, what the Bible teaches us about partiality, along with what the Bible teaches us about sexuality. Makes it hard because the cultural cross currents are moving against each other. And this is why, just looking back at some of the resources we've produced during this time, this is why Rebecca McLaughlin's book, The Secular Creed, has been so helpful and why it's been so popular. It's just been a bestseller for us because she walks better than anybody else I know, walks through to be able to delineate between what the Bible teaches on race and what the Bible teaches on sexuality in ways that are certainly not handled well by our political parties or our media or other cultural leaders.
Yeah. Just that bundling makes me think there's all kinds of things that got bundled, right? So those conversations where you would before have both political parties or people from different churches a lot closer and at least able to sort through nuances of things. And all of this got worse because of our screens. So number 2 on your list, Collin, driven by the iPhone, our lives shifted digital.
Yeah. Well, Mike knows this because we work on these projects all the time, but when you're trying to assess the significance of a cultural change, and let's just take something, for example, let's just take 2 examples here. One would be, why would fertility collapse across nearly every country around the world at almost the same time? You can have theological conversations about this. You can have political, you can have economic conversations about this. But one of the ways you have to look at this is through technological adoption. And that's why we look back and say, well, on the one hand, we're not seeing nearly as many teen pregnancies as we saw before. We're not seeing nearly as much drunk driving. That's positive. On the negative side, that's because people aren't having sex very much anymore, and they're not hanging out with each other anymore. Why? Because they're on their phones. Not only on their phones, you can also add streaming services, which is another thing that's new these last 25 years, but it is primarily the phones. Now, that's one issue. And the other issue you can look at, which we've covered, and Sarah, you've done a great podcast on this, would definitely be the mental health of young women in particular. And we know that Jean Twenge, Jonathan Haidt especially, have been the lead advocates for recognizing a connection between this widespread decline in teenage female mental health that corresponds to the adoption of the iPhone, invented in 2007, but not widespread adopted, especially among young women, until 2012. Now, I was just teaching on this recently at a church outside of Atlanta, and I was introducing them to the terms of like rapid onset gender dysphoria, social contagions. How can an idea take something like, in the course of a few short years, that say 5 to 10% of the American population would identify as LGBTQ. How does that number go in a few years to 40% of young women identifying that way. And then this is noteworthy, and in the last 2 years, declining dramatically again. Well, that's the theory of social contagion, which is the way an idea will spread dramatically through social networks in a way that produces widespread effect. But again, how does that happen? It doesn't happen without the communication. It doesn't happen without a kind of a social imaginary that you inhabit that is driven by these perceptions shaped by your device, which occupies this overwhelming role in your life. So when you're talking about any theological conversation in the last 25 years, it is very difficult to conceive of how it has not been shaped by the iPhone, which has given you the rise of YouTube. It's given you the rise of podcasts. It's given you the rise of audiobooks. A lot of these things are really positive. Of course, we wouldn't be wasting all of this. We'd be wasting all this time if we didn't care about that. That's how most people are engaging with us right now, and we're thankful for that. Good things can spread just like the negative things can spread. But there are issues underneath issues, and the iPhone is the most significant invention of our last 25 years that has the most explanatory power for not only our theological discourse in the church, but any number of broader civilizational level trends in shifting plausibility structures. That's the iPhone. Sarah, again, you've done so much research on this. What are some of the other effects that you see?
Yeah, what I was just thinking about as you were talking was another thing Jean Twenge points out in her book, Generations, is that you think generations are shaped by events or something big that happens, a war or 9/11 or something, but really they're shaped by technology. Which makes me think back to, we were just mentioning the number of abortions that are rising around the world, not for a political reason, but for a technological reason. Now we have the pill, and it's so much easier and it's so much cheaper, and you can just do it in your own house. And so the reason abortions went down for all those years had almost nothing to do with any restrictions that were passed at the state level or who is in the White House. And the reason they're going back up doesn't have anything to do with it either. So I was just thinking about how technology shifts us.
We covered this earlier, but and I just have to remind us sometimes of some basic facts. Do we think that the number of minority men being shot by police officers, especially in unjust ways, do we think that problem has gotten a lot worse in the last 25 years? We have a lot more awareness of it. But do we think that the numbers have increased a lot or the injustice has increased a lot? Not likely. It's probably more plausible that our awareness is what's really changed, which has a lot of positive effect because now we can do something about it. We can reform police. We can finally hold people to account. We can put them in jail. There's all sorts of positive things, but it also changes our sense that the world is getting a lot worse. I'm more physically threatened. Just thinking about how many violent, horrible deaths are we subjected to having to watch nearly live if you just want to be on your phone at all. I can be looking for recruiting updates for Northwestern football, and boom, all of a sudden, I'm watching a guy get executed in the streets. That's a different experience and a very disorienting one. Mike, how do we even cope with that?
There's so much complexity of, when I think about the first half of my life and how knowledge was acquired, how knowledge was acquired was primarily in the classroom and through books. And the second half of my life, and at this point in my life, it's almost like half was in, one century and, a little bit more than half in this century. Now what was embodied and physical is largely disembodied and digital. And so, most of the learning that I'm happening is being mediated on screens. And even within this century, the evolution of that is shifting rapidly. So most of the source material for the first 22 years of this century was primarily occurring through primary sources. I'm reading ebooks, I'm reading PDFs, I'm reading articles, I'm reading essays, I'm watching videos, so on and so forth. But then in the last 3 years, there's been a big shift there to artificial intelligence with the large language models. And now, what was primary source material is now secondary source material. And so, what stands between me and knowledge is, basically, massive statistics and massive compute that, statistics plus words equals what comes out of, the large language models. And so it's not that there's some big conspiracy or whatever that Silicon Valley is trying to, do this to us or that to us, but there's a sense in which Silicon Valley are now the high priests of epistemological knowledge. And as people move away from Google search, which would put you back into primary sources, now they're just going to get summaries that gives you a statistical distillation average of, all the stuff that it's been trained on, good, bad, and everything in between. The greater complexity to, and related to AI is, it's not like AI is new, because the same technology that kind of, drove, we've had AI in our pockets for years.
Yeah.
When you go back to 2010, when Meta, introduced PageRank, the first algorithm on the Facebook timeline, it's not that different of a technology that was kind of mediating what it is that we saw. So these are not new things and new trends, but the challenge is moving forward is the ways in which we've become siloed, because attention is money. Okay. And almost all of these tech companies are publicly traded, and the ones that aren't are trying to become publicly traded. And so when attention and money are the same thing, and you have shareholders and you have to feed those shareholders money, then, every tech company is trying to get more and more of your attention. Well, how did they get more and more of your attention? Well, they need to show you things that you want to see. And what that does is that incentivizes technology not from a truth orientation. It incentivizes things from an attention orientation. And the problem with that is that humans are fallen and broken. And so in order for the tech companies to make money, they have to do things that actually push us further into our depravity. And so this presents real challenges for the future of knowledge, for the future of our faith. And if we really want to bring this thing full circle to a number of different threads, let me tie a couple knots for us and put a bow on this. Okay, so we talked about fertility and we've talked about Gen Z quite a bit. Okay, well, what happens, and we've talked about institutions and distrust and the rising distrust in institutions. These have been all things that we've discussed in this top 10. All right, let me bring all these threads together. Okay, so as the distrust in institutions has risen, and as people have increasingly gone for their information diet, where they go to seek out knowledge, intentionally or unintentionally, they go to highly individualistically, algorithmically controlled methods, whether that's AI or through algorithms and social media. They're increasingly seeing things that are what they want to hear. And so people increasingly go down highly individualistic rabbit holes. And so what happened in the past is that men and women often did not diverge too much ideologically or even politically. They often, movements one way or the other, they were done in parallel like schools of fish. But that has changed in the last, 10 to 12 years with the era of smartphones, social media, and now AI. And so you have young women who have one very, very specific type of media diet that trends one way. And now you have young men whose media diet trends a very different way. And the reason why those things didn't work that way in the past was because institutions, physical institutions, had a mediating influence. And men and women would move together, and they, whatever the ebb and flow and the tide of men and women, they would still move together because they were still a part of those physically mediated institutions. But now in this anti-institutional era, in this era where everybody's information diet is completely individualized, we're going back to the era of the judges where everybody just does what's right in their own eyes. So young men are moving one way,
right.
Young women are moving the other way, and now this impacts marriage rates. It's going to impact fertility. It's going to impact the voting patterns, and all of these things from a demographic standpoint are going to get very interesting.
And then add sycophancy. You talk about this in the AI Christian benchmark, the idea that AI gives us what we want to hear. It's not giving us the facts. It's giving us summaries of what we expect it to be able to hear. So that's exacerbated in here. And I just look back as we head toward the number one issue here. There's so many things that they push in so many different directions. And I think we've handled, like you said there, Mike, a lot of the complexity of this, and seeing that you pull one thread and then 20 more follow in there. That's what makes a story rise to that level of number two, of being that big. But in this online shift, it's one more thing to be able to add here is the role that the online world has played in relating to a lot of the abuse scandals of the last 25 years. And I go back again thinking about the Great Awakening, thinking about these officer-involved shootings of African-American men. Was there a huge increase? No, but our perception has changed, and hopefully our ability to try to change it. That's the ideal. Similarly, do we think that priests, and unfortunately it's not limited to Catholic priests by any means, do we think that problem started in the year 2000? Obviously not. Do we think that it got worse in the year 2000 and since then? I don't think that's even very likely either. But how has our awareness of the problem changed dramatically? That is because, as you go back to the Boston Globe 2002 Spotlight series, there have been priests who were brought up on charges and put in jail for this, but you wouldn't find it in your newspaper, or you would see it. You could see it, but you'd have to find it buried in a very large newspaper. Another thing that's disappeared in the last 25 years. But then with Spotlight, the internet, you can now see it anywhere you go and anywhere around the world. And that's now true of any given controversy. We've alluded to this already, but that is a major shift of how every single theological issue and challenge in the church can be immediately imputed to the whole. And that underlines so many different assumptions. So, Mike, I think you do a great job there of just laying out the way that the shift toward the digital creates an entirely different social imaginary that transforms what we regard to be plausible, good, bad, in ways that are shaped, and we are shaped then in ways that we are not actively comprehending, because we're receiving them as simply a reflection of the world, but the reflection we have is Narcissus. It turns out the reflection is us and what we want to see, or worse, what we fear the most. That's the real danger here, and you have got to fight back against that. And we try at the Gospel Quotient to fight back against that by telling all these positive stories of how God's at work in the world through what Sarah does. But we also try to do this by going back to what you said, Mike, which is to focus on the mediating institutions, the community, the family, the church. These have been ordained for our good. And that's why they're so necessary, because that will allow us then to come together and not to be subject to the whims of the ever-changing algorithm and the device in our pockets.
And give us a relationship that is real and healthy. Yeah, that's good. I think this is a huge story. Honestly, Collin, I thought this was going to be number one. The way that digital life has changed us over since we were, in college. It's been huge.
Yeah.
But I think that was my chronological snobbery, because I was thinking about what was urgent rather than what was important. And your number one is actually not a new story. And I think a lot of people maybe even would be surprised at how old it was. So what did you pick and why for number one?
Yeah, it's 9/11. So here's why it's 9/11. Now, let me give you the case for why maybe the phones should have been first, okay? I think just think about this. Imagine if 9/11 happened today. What would Twitter do with that? What would Reddit do with that? What would AI do with that? Sometimes I wonder if we could have survived that. I mean that literally. I don't know what we would have done to tear each other apart through that, or just all of the wildest conspiracy theories exploding on us at the exact same time that we're all just trying to come to terms with what we have just watched happen. So the kind of mass trauma experienced by something, one of the first, there have been other bad things that we've seen happen. We've seen space shuttles blow up, which happened also in the last, it's happened a couple times, unfortunately, of course. But we've seen bad things happen before. We've seen things reported almost live. Think about the Vietnam War as an example, or the Tet Offensive in '68, whatnot. But nothing quite like the experience of what we watched, so many of us watched in 9/11. That, when you look back in the last 25 years, if you asked people, what's the one thing that you would cite as the where were you when? It's got to be 9/11. Now, COVID-19, what was the first moment you realized the world was going to shut down? I can remember that too. You guys probably can as well. But the number one is definitely 9/11. When we are, Lord willing, if He gives us 80 years, we're still going to be talking about where were you on September 11th, 2001, and how did that change your life? So that's just kind of the broader scope there. But I want to drill down into a couple different applications of this. When you're at that 30,000-foot view, and then when you keep rising to look bigger picture, you need to zoom out to history. And when you look at the past, and then you use the past to come through our time period, these 25 years, our lifetimes, then you look forward, you see what was the big story back then, that was the big story today, that will be the big story in the future. Is it not the relationship and the conflict between Christianity and Islam? Because it's not atheism that is growing, and that is going not in the global perspective. It's a Western phenomenon. It's not growing. Of course, it's a communist phenomenon as well, but with significant implications in China, but not so much in post-Soviet world. So it's not atheism. It's not communism. It's not Hinduism, which is not a converting religion. It's largely an Indian phenomenon. We talked about Hindu nationalism. It's not Buddhism. You keep coming. It's not Mormonism. It's grown a lot, but it's not taking over. So what is going to be the dominant block formation of how people organize? Well, there's going to be a world that's been largely shaped and continued to be shaped by Christianity, and there's a world that's been shaped by Islam. And those are going to come in conflict, in part because of their similarities. These are three of the great monotheistic religions to go along with Judaism, but also their dramatic, substantial differences, submission at the heart of Islam and grace at the heart of Christianity. One of the most significant books I read during this time period was by Joseph Henrich at Harvard University, The Weirdest People in the World, Western Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. And the framing of our entire civilization as having been formed over the course of 1,500 years by Christian practices and assumptions, namely around the family and the community and the neighborhood, just like we just talked about in the last one. But what are those parts of the world that have never been shaped in the same way by fundamental Christian assumptions about freedom, about organization, about community, about family? It's obviously the Islamic places. And then going forward, what do we see as the kind of the major dispute across Western countries today? Was immigration. And it's different for us in the United States because most of our immigrants come from Central and South America. And that, of course, are largely Christian places, but that's not the case in Europe. So when we can consider the implications in this next generation beyond, it seems as though, and I talked about this in my secularism podcast for Gospelbound, it seems like we need a re-encounter with Christianity, or we will see some kind of continued growth or beyond from Islam. So that seems to be when we really zoom out furthest in history, when we really get the highest elevation, and then we come to a specific event that had that kind of mass trauma effect of the where with you. I think that's why it needs to be 9/11 as the most significant theological story. Now, let me just add one more bit that explains what's the further theological element here. I've shared this before. It's not original to me. I've seen it from Tim Keller and many others. But the shift that you started us with, Sarah, the shift that frames the entire great dechurching of what was different in 2000 from what was different in 2025 is a story in part about the shift from the world of the 1990s was a post-communist period where for decades, the person who was the model American was somebody who was not a communist. Namely, they were a believer in God, not an atheist. Okay? That's the model American. So the enemy American, the enemy that we need to oppose internally and externally is the atheist, the communist. Since 9/11, and largely because of 9/11, you saw that shift. You see the rise of the new atheism is very much a post-9/11 phenomenon. The broadening, I mentioned that shift in the Bush administration in 2005. What was a major factor? Labeling everybody who held a biblical view on sexuality to be a, quote, fundamentalist. And what are fundamentalists? They are those people who take their religion so seriously and are so intent on imposing on everyone else that they would even fly planes into buildings. So, Mike, you talked about how the Great Awakening conflates race and sexuality. This is the conflation of 9/11 with sexuality. So why was the pump primed for us to be able to shift so quickly on homosexuality? Because anybody who argued was a fundamentalist, and fundamentalists are the people who fly planes into buildings. It's Westboro Baptist Church, which I alluded to earlier, in there as well. So look at all of the implications. And then one last one is 9/11 triggered, it brought the theological question of theodicy. Why does God allow evil? Of course, because of what we experienced with that. I mean, that's such a traumatic event that we have to be able to cope with. We have to understand, where is God in a world with this kind of evil? Do you guys remember what happened then just a few years later? The Southeast Asian tsunami. Then you have Hurricane Katrina, 2005. There's that 2005 again. And mass culture-wide questions about theodicy, where Christians were very much on the defensive, pushed by the new atheists who were dominating the bestseller lists at the time, saying that a good God would never allow all these things to happen. Therefore, we can't trust God. And we certainly can't trust his teachers here on earth. So that's my case for why I think that is at the top of this list. And again, it's long time back, but even though we don't think about it every day, it doesn't have that kind of ever-present effect like the smartphone does. I think it's underneath a lot of what we're experiencing. And I think you could easily look at the rest of our lifetimes and say, that will still be a dominant story for as long as we live.
Mike, do you agree with him? Do you think that's the number one?
Yeah, no, the reason why for me is because it deals with civilizations. Okay. What you have is a clash of two very different civilizations, and beneath them is religion for both. Obviously, the civilizational religion in continental Europe is more in disrepair and looks different than what it does in even the UK or in North America. But yeah, I mean, you have a clash of civilizations. This is also the same reason why, at numerous points in this top 10 list, the East and West and, China and, and USA piece has come up a number of times in different ways because it's civilizational in nature. And so these are massive trends. One of the things that, Collin, that you've talked about at a couple different places is when we're doing cultural analysis, a lot of cultural analysis happens in kind of the kiddie pool, shallowness. And what we need is to have a more kind of deep sea approach where we're going all the way down to the seafloor in very deep bodies of water. And so for me, it doesn't get any more deep than when we talk about clashes between civilizations, because that is water that is always going to be there, and we've got to be able to reckon with how those things impact and play behind the scenes in almost everything that we do. The hard part about civilizational challenge, civilizational friction, is that it's often invisible. We're not thinking about the ocean floor, but that water is there, and it's really, really important. And it's some of the most important cultural analysis that we do. And that's why we do stuff like these, this top 10 list for, of the last 25 years, because you are not doing cultural analysis until you get all the way down to the ocean floor. So much of what counts for cultural analysis today is basically splashing around at the surface of, whatever happened or whatever we saw on the internet, or, whoever got upset with, who about, something that really isn't news. This is news. 9/11 is news. I will remember exactly where I was when that happened, for the rest of my life. And so for me, 9/11 is 100% number one, because it's civilizational in nature. And look, I mean, there's a lot of people who are going to be listening to this who weren't even born.
Not alive.
And they have no memory of that. Mm-hmm. And so this is very, if you're listening to this, go talk to your mom and dad about, and if your grandma and grandpa, about where they were and what were their experiences like. And same for your pastor.
Well, just a couple things real quickly to wrap up on this one. We've seen these historic Christian communities across the Middle East, many of them decline, some of them entirely disappearing. That's a direct consequence of 9/11, and of course, especially then the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, ordered by President Bush. On top of that, you also have the broader regional instability of the Middle East precipitated by the Iraq War, leading to things like the Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War is the major impetus for the mass migration into Europe, leading to the current debates about immigration that are become maybe the most pressing issue right now in politics across the West. So even we could pull all these different threads and find other specific things in there as well.
Those are all pretty dark. Is there any bright spot or way that you can see God that worked through 9/11?
It's great about asking about that, Sarah, and I appreciate that. Something that 9/11 has helped me to think through is the nature of divine providence. This is a theological list, after all. And I think not only about what God allows that we see, but also what he prevents that we never even know about or never even think about. And you, of course, Sarah, you covered the 9/11 attacks and looking back on an anniversary, and it was the first episodes of a recorded podcast, right?
Yep.
Looking at the 20th anniversary, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I think you could see what I saw, which was, first of all, there were not other attacks. There hasn't been anything in the United States on that kind of scale since then. New York City did not empty. In many ways, just in terms of day-to-day life, of course, the loss of life was horrific, though thankfully not as horrific as we all thought it would be at the time. Still very bad, but in some ways, COVID-19 ended up being more long-term disruptive to New York City, because that was a ground zero in the United States for that. But then you also see, and this is why I write books about history, and I like to think about big ideas and like to learn from different leaders through history. But when I was working on my book on Tim Keller that I've revised and updated recently for paperback re-release, I just was able to think very much about how we wouldn't really have known his ministry or thought about that ministry without the spotlight that was provided by 9/11 and the rallying across the country toward the people of New York specifically. And so the worst tragedies will, as we often see, they draw out the worst in people, but they also bring out the best. They also lead people to ask really hard and necessary questions. They wake us up from our slumbers. And so God is doing we've heard many people say this before, he's doing a million things at once, and maybe we're aware of a few of them. And that's even including the worst tragedies, but that's one that I would identify. What would you add, Sarah? I mean, again, you're the one who's done the deep dive reporting on this.
I would add maybe a question, because I'm not as familiar with this as I should be, but I know after 9/11, there was kind of a rush toward New York City with funds, but also with church planters, and kind of a drawing of church planting toward the city. And I wonder how much that played in the next, I guess there's a wave, I guess you would call it, of the Acts 29, but all kinds of people, the SBC creating Send
city
Network.
To city. I mean, Redeemer and City to City would be primary.
Right. And it was a time of people doing the hardest ministry, which is church planting, in the hardest areas, which are urban centers. And so it just felt like that played a role there.
Well, I think you're right about that, Sarah. I think the spotlight on urban America and New York in particular definitely changed people's perceptions. There was a lot more sympathy toward people who lived there, as opposed to especially what had been inherited from the 1980s. And so I remember getting to a point where people I lived with in other parts of the country, and my wife and I did live out there outside of New York for the 10-year anniversary, but living in other different places, there was a time when if you said, I'm going to go try to start this thing in New York, like when Tim Keller did it in the 1980s, when people would say, oh no, that's a bad idea, I would never do that. And then all of a sudden, especially through the growth of Redeemer, growth of a lot of those church plants and Keller's ministry and things like that, people would then say, I'm so jealous of you. You get to be there. You get to go to these churches. You get to be able to see that. And I haven't, I've talked about this and written about this as well, but I don't think you can separate the Young Restless Reformed movement from 9/11. I think there was a shift, especially among the millennial generation and some of Gen X, that those who were in college, just after college, those people that you've covered, they were at One Day 2000 with John Piper there in Tennessee. They were in school watching these things. There was very much a sense of seriousness, of purpose, of God is God and he demands everything, or I shouldn't be messing around. I mean, it was just very much a sobering, I guess is the way to put it. And so then all these hard questions coming, you needed a robust theology to be able to respond to them. Well, of all things Reformed theology will give you, it's a pretty good theodicy there. So yeah, you can see the rise of the new atheism. You can also see the rise of the Young Restless Reformed. You can also see the rise of New York City church planting. And if we just want to look very narrowly at the church scene in New York City, it's very clear. Tim Keller documented this very clear. Huge growth of the evangelical church in the couple decades between 9/11 and COVID-19, which of course was really tough for churches in New York. So yeah, definitely some positives, and do appreciate you bringing us back to that, Sarah.
I think that's a great place to end us, thinking about the providence of God and the hand of God over the last 25 years. Through things we never saw coming, to bring good out of things that looked only dark, and to be always surprising us, I guess, right? Of like, oh, here's the next thing that's coming around the bend that he is working out for good. And what an amazing thing that we serve a God who works everything for the good of those who love him. So thank you so much to those of you who listened. Thank you so much to Mike and Collin for spending your time chatting with us today. Collin, thanks for being on Gospelbound.
Glad to be here. I love it. I'll stick around for a little while longer. Keep doing this. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for listening to this episode of Gospelbound. For more interviews and to sign up for my newsletter, head over to tgc.org/gospelbound. Rate and review Gospelbound on your favorite podcast platform so others can join the conversation. Until next time, remember, when we're bound to the gospel, we abound in hope.